trauma with this guy, man, and the whole situation. And I just want to say, I think he needs a lot of prayer, and he needs mental health, like the things that we can relate to, you know?
Absolutely.
I think that's what's going to save him or help him.
Yeah.
Nothing else. I don't think we should talk about him. I don't think we should make fun of him.
The room went silent the moment the footage was mentioned, not because people saw it, but because of what Kay said it represented. In a raw, emotional moment that quickly spread online, Kay reportedly broke down while discussing a tape he claims exists, one tied to Diddy, and the pressure he says surrounded his early career. According to circulating commentary, Kay didn't describe the tape in explicit terms. Instead, he focused on the impact, the feeling of being controlled, exploited, and pushed into situations he says stripped him of agency. As the story moved fast, fans of DAY26 struggled to process the shift, from nostalgia to something far heavier. The language being used online, passed around, manipulated, sparked outrage and confusion, even as details remained unclear and unverified. What made the moment hit harder wasn't what was shown, but why Kay said he could no longer stay silent. This wasn't framed as scandal for shock value. It was framed as pain, old, unresolved, and resurfacing all at once. And the internet reacted instantly, demanding answers before anyone had a chance to breathe. Because if Kay is telling his truth now, then the silence before wasn't consent. It was survival. To understand why Kay's emotional moment struck such a nerve, you have to rewind to the environment that created DAY26 in the first place. The group wasn't formed quietly or organically. It was born inside a pressure cooker of competition, cameras, and power dynamics that rewarded obedience as much as talent. For a young artist like Kay, success arrived fast, but so did expectations that were never fully explained. When opportunity comes wrapped in authority, saying no doesn't always feel like an option. Kay has spoken over the years about feeling conflicted during that era, grateful for the platform, yet uneasy about the cost. Fame came with contracts, access, and unspoken rules. The music industry, especially at that time, operated on proximity to power. Those closest to decision-makers thrived. Those who questioned boundaries risked being sidelined. That imbalance shaped how young performers navigated their careers, often choosing silence over resistance. The emotional history deepens when you consider how Diddy was perceived within that system. To many, he represented the gatekeeper, the person who could elevate careers or quietly stall them. Even without explicit instructions, that kind of influence can create compliance through implication alone. Artists didn't need to be told what was expected. They learned quickly by watching who advanced and who disappeared. That atmosphere matters when evaluating why someone might feel used years later, even if details were never publicly discussed at the time. Kay's breakdown, as described by those who witnessed it, wasn't about one incident. It was about accumulated weight. Years of holding conflicting feelings. Years of questioning whether moments of discomfort were normal or something to be buried for the sake of success. When he referenced a tape, the emphasis from supporters was not on what it showed, but on why its existence symbolized control and vulnerability rather than leverage. The phrase used by other men, circulating online, reflects interpretation rather than confirmed fact, but it captures the emotional language Kay reportedly used to describe how powerless he felt. That choice of words resonated because it spoke to exploitation without detailing acts. It suggested a loss of agency more than a specific event, and that distinction is critical. Trauma doesn't always live in explicit memories. Sometimes it lives in the realization that consent was never fully present. Fans of DAY26 struggled with this reframing. What once felt like a nostalgic success story now carried darker undertones. Viewers revisited old clips with new eyes, noticing moments that felt uncomfortable in hindsight, long silences, nervous laughter, rigid compliance. None of it proved anything, but it added emotional context to why Kay might be speaking now, years after the fact. What makes this backstory especially heavy is the passage of time. Speaking late doesn't mean speaking falsely. Often, it means finally feeling safe enough to talk. Distance from the system that once held power can unlock honesty that wasn't possible before. Kay's tears, according to supporters, weren't performative. They were the release of something held too long. This emotional history doesn't resolve anything. It doesn't confirm allegations or define guilt. What it does is explain why the moment landed so hard. It reveals a pattern familiar to many artists who entered fame young, gratitude tangled with regret, success shadowed by silence. And once that silence breaks, the past doesn't whisper. It floods back, demanding to be heard, even if answers remain out of reach. The main conflict erupted the moment Kay's emotional account stopped being treated as a vague expression of pain and began to be interpreted as an allegation with implications. That shift changed everything. What Kay described as a deeply personal experience, years of feeling controlled, pressured, and stripped of agency, was rapidly reframed online as a story demanding proof, names, and conclusions. The internet didn't ask how he felt. It asked what exactly happened. For Kay, this was the most destabilizing part of speaking out. According to supporters, his intention wasn't to sensationalize. It was to explain why he carried unresolved trauma from his early career. But once the words tape and Diddy appeared in the same sentence, the conversation shifted from emotional truth to investigative frenzy. Screenshots circulated. Old interviews resurfaced. People searched for meaning in silence that had lasted years. The conflict intensified because Kay's account didn't offer the kind of details audiences expect from viral scandals. There were no dates, no explicit descriptions, no named participants beyond power figures already publicly known. That lack of specificity frustrated some viewers, who demanded clarity before belief. Others argued that trauma doesn't unfold on demand and that expecting perfect recollection ignores how power dynamics operate. Then came the first shocking twist. As the story spread, careful observers pointed out that Kay never presented the tape as evidence meant to be released publicly. According to commentary, he referenced it as something that existed, something that symbolized leverage and fear at the time, not as proof he planned to weaponize. The shock was realizing that the tape's existence mattered more emotionally than its contents. It represented silence enforced by power, not a reveal waiting to happen. This twist reframed the entire conflict. The narrative wasn't about exposing a hidden video. It was about understanding why someone would live under the weight of knowing such material existed at all. That distinction mattered, yet it struggled to survive in a culture that rewards spectacle over context. As the debate raged, Diddy's name took on symbolic weight. For some, he represented the industry's unchecked authority during that era. For others, the absence of direct accusation meant caution was necessary. That split hardened quickly. Defenders emphasized the need for verification. Critics emphasized the need to listen to survivors even when details are incomplete. Both sides claimed moral ground. The conflict reached its most volatile point when commentators began speaking for Kay, assigning motives, inventing timelines, and drawing conclusions he hadn't stated. In doing so, they risked repeating the very dynamic he described, losing control over his own narrative. What began as an act of vulnerability was being reshaped into content. Behind the scenes, supporters urged restraint. They emphasized that Kay's tears were not a strategy. They were the visible result of pressure finally lifting. Detractors accused him of ambiguity. The space between those positions grew tense, revealing how unprepared audiences often are for stories that refuse to fit clean categories. By the end of this phase, one truth became unavoidable. The conflict wasn't about proving an event. It was about validating an experience. The shocking twist wasn't hidden footage or sudden confession. It was the realization that many people only recognize harm when it's packaged as evidence, not when it's shared as emotion. Because once a survivor speaks, the world often demands performance, clarity, precision, proof, instead of care. And that demand was about to push the story into a dangerous escalation, where speculation, loyalty, and power would collide again, this time with even higher stakes. The escalation didn't come from new revelations. It came from interpretation hardening into certainty. As Kay's emotional words continued to circulate, commentary shifted from empathy to interrogation. Clips were reposted with heavier captions. Tone was rewritten. What began as a vulnerable account of feeling exploited was increasingly framed as a criminal accusation, even though Kay himself never crossed that line. For Kay, this phase was destabilizing. The very act of speaking, meant to release pressure, created new pressure. Supporters urged him to protect himself and stop engaging. Critics demanded clarity he wasn't offering. The escalation revealed a brutal paradox. Silence had once kept him safe, but speaking now made him vulnerable again, this time to misrepresentation. The role of Diddy grew more symbolic as the conversation intensified. Without a direct accusation or response, his name became a stand-in for an era of unchecked power. For some, that symbolism felt overdue. For others, it felt dangerously imprecise. The absence of specifics turned debate into ideology, listening to survivors versus protecting due process. Both sides spoke loudly. Neither listened much. Then came the second major twist. A number of industry voices, former artists, producers, and commentators began reframing the story away from a single individual and toward a systemic pattern. They argued that Kay's experience mirrored that of many young performers who entered fame under rigid control structures, where leverage didn't need to be explicit to be effective. Contracts, access, and proximity to power were enough. The twist was realizing that the story didn't require a villain to be valid. It required acknowledgement of an environment. This reframing shifted the escalation in a critical way. The question was no longer what did the tape show, but why did the tape matter at all? It mattered because it represented silence enforced by imbalance, fear created by authority, choices narrowed by consequence. In that context, the phrase used by other men was understood by many as emotional shorthand, not a literal description. As this perspective spread, the internet split again, this time along generational lines. Older artists nodded in recognition. Younger audiences demanded clearer accountability. The escalation fed on this divide, turning nuance into noise. Each camp felt morally certain. Complexity struggled to survive. Behind the scenes, sources suggested Kay grew quieter, not because he was retreating, but because the narrative had slipped beyond his control. The tape, once a symbol of fear, had become a symbol of expectation. People wanted it released. They wanted proof. They wanted spectacle. And in wanting those things, they risked re-traumatizing the very person they claimed to support. By the end of this phase, the second twist had fully landed. This story was no longer about a tape or a person. It was about power remembered and power challenged. The escalation exposed how quickly conversations about harm can be derailed by demands for certainty that trauma rarely provides. Because when escalation rewards absolutes, stories that live in gray get distorted. And with the pressure now at its peak, the fallout, public and emotional, was inevitable, shaping not only how this moment would be remembered, but how future voices might decide whether it's safe to speak at all. By the time the story reached this stage, the fallout had moved far beyond Kay's original words and into the collective conscience of the audience. What people were reacting to now wasn't just what Kay said, it was what his pain forced them to confront about power, silence, and complicity. The emotional weight of his breakdown lingered, even as opinions grew louder and more divided. Public reactions split sharply. One side expressed deep empathy, emphasizing that Kay's tears and hesitation spoke volumes about long-held trauma. For these supporters, the absence of explicit details wasn't a weakness. It was evidence of how power imbalances suppress clarity. They argued that the focus should remain on listening, not litigating. In their eyes, demanding proof replicated the very dynamics Kay described. The other side responded with discomfort and skepticism. They worried that implication without confirmation could unfairly damage reputations, especially when Diddy was named symbolically rather than accused directly. This group called for restraint, urging audiences to separate emotional validation from factual determination. The tension between these positions hardened into talking points, not dialogue. Emotionally, the fallout for Kay appeared heavy. Supporters noted how quickly his vulnerability was turned into content, clipped, captioned, and reposted with increasing certainty. The internet's appetite for conclusions clashed with his apparent need for safety. What was meant as release became another source of pressure. Silence returned, not as protection from power, but as protection from misinterpretation. The ripple effects extended to Day26 itself. Fans revisited the group's origin story with a different lens, questioning moments they once celebrated. Nostalgia gave way to discomfort. This reframing didn't prove wrongdoing, but it altered memory, demonstrating how present revelations can reshape the past. For Diddy, the fallout existed largely in symbolism. Without a direct response or accusation to answer, his name circulated as shorthand for industry authority during that era. Some viewed this as overdue accountability. Others saw it as imprecise and unfair. The absence of clarity amplified both views, leaving perception to do the work facts could not. As days passed, fatigue set in. Even engaged viewers admitted the conversation felt heavy and unresolved. The story wasn't evolving. It was echoing. Each repetition carried less information and more emotion. The fallout had crossed from urgent to draining, signaling a collective unease with how the narrative had unfolded. What remained was a quiet reckoning. Speaking up can heal, but it can also expose. The public fallout revealed how fragile the space is for stories that don't offer clean answers. It showed how easily empathy can be overshadowed by demands for certainty, and how quickly a person's pain can be overshadowed by debate. Because public fallout isn't always explosive. Sometimes it's the lingering realization that a story asked more questions than it answered, and that the cost of asking them was borne by the person who spoke first. And with emotions still raw and nothing definitively settled, the story edged toward its final turn, one shaped not by revelation, but by the consequences of belief. The final twist didn't come from a release of the tape, a lawsuit, or a public confrontation. It came from something far quieter and far more unsettling. Nothing happened next. No footage surfaced. No formal accusations were filed. No detailed statements clarified what the tape contained or how it was used. And yet, the story refused to disappear. The absence of resolution became the twist itself. People realized that the moment wasn't leading toward proof. It was exposing how uncomfortable the truth can be when it doesn't arrive in neat, verifiable pieces. 4K, the cliffhanger lived in the aftermath. Speaking had lifted one burden, but it created another. His words were now frozen in clips and captions, interpreted without him in the room. Supporters urged him to protect his peace. Critics demanded clarity he never promised to provide. The twist was recognizing that vulnerability doesn't always bring closure. It can leave a person standing alone between belief and disbelief. For Diddy, the silence worked differently. Without a direct accusation to answer, the moment passed without official response. Yet the implication lingered in public memory, not as a fact, but as a question mark. The cliffhanger here wasn't guilt or innocence, it was how power is remembered. Once a name becomes symbolic of an era, it carries meanings that outlive any single story. The industry's reaction added another layer. Quiet acknowledgments from veteran voices suggested K's experience wasn't unique, even if details differed. That collective murmur reframed the moment as part of a larger pattern, one that doesn't rely on one tape or one person. The twist was realizing the story didn't need to resolve to be important. Its significance lived in what it revealed about silence, leverage, and survival. And that's where the cliffhanger holds. Will K ever choose to share more? Or was speaking once enough? Will the industry confront the systems that create fear without requiring spectacle? Or will this moment fade, only to resurface years later when another voice breaks the same silence? Because some stories don't end with answers. They end with permission for others to speak, to question, to remember. And once that permission exists, it can't be taken back. The screen goes dark here, not because the story is finished, but because the next chapter depends on who dares to speak next. This is where the story hands the conversation to you. What K shared wasn't a verdict, it was a window. A glimpse into how power, silence, and survival intersect in spaces where opportunity and control are tightly linked. Whether you believe every implication or approach the story with caution, one thing is clear: moments like this ask us to listen differently. So, ask yourself, when someone speaks emotionally without offering proof, what do they deserve first: belief, patience, or protection? Can we acknowledge pain without rushing to judgment? And how do we hold powerful systems accountable without turning individual vulnerability into spectacle? There's no single right answer, but there is responsibility in how we share, comment, and engage. Stories like this don't just shape opinions, they shape whether others feel safe to speak at all. Drop your thoughts in the comments, respectfully. This isn't about attacking or defending a person. It's about examining the environment that makes silence feel safer than truth. If you want more deep dives that stay focused on the title, avoid harmful speculation, and center human impact over hype, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because the most important stories aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes, they're the ones that leave us sitting in silence, wondering what it really costs to speak.